Good, fantastic. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and hopefully everyone is still with us. I know spending lots of time on Zoom can be quite tiring, so I shall try and keep it relatively brief and to the point today, so that we do finish on time. I'm also aware that Ian, the big boss man for the BPCA, is following me, so I shall try not to run over. I'm just going to have a little bit of a chat today about fly control, and I've focused on cluster and other small flies. And that may well seem quite a strange combination to be talking about. But one of the key messages that I want to get across today is the importance of identification and survey. And Matt started off brilliantly today talking about the survey techniques and the importance of that survey. So, half of my job is really already done through the work that Matt's done, and the importance of doing that survey and getting the identification right on these flies. That can be a real important thing when we talk about any form of fly control. So this is me. My name's Paul. For those of you who haven't had the misfortune to listen to me speak or attend one of my training courses, I do a lot of training for the BPCA, and there is a good sales pitch here. If you want to know more about fly control, we do run a full-day training course on flies and their control, and we get really involved in some of the detail that we can in a full-day session. So if you want to learn more, have a look at that course and come and join us for that particular one. So my day job is working for Veritas Pest Consultancy, where I'm a field biologist. It's probably my main role. So we offer field biology support work for pest control companies, for food manufacturers, and anyone else who really wants to get involved with delivering high-end professional pest control. I do lots and lots of different training courses and bits and pieces like that as well. And I'm also very proud to be a member of the BPCA board. That was something that I started doing last year. And I've got a real passion to make sure that as an industry, we do as much as we can to be seen by the people that buy our services as professional. And I've got a real strong passion for making sure our environmental impact is as minimal as possible. So my role on the executive board means that I have the opportunity to discuss things that members may have concerns with. So if you want to liaise with me regarding any concerns you have as a BPCA member, then I'll happily listen to those as well. So let's have a look at these flies. So we're talking about the order of insects called Diptera, the true flies, and it's an amazingly diverse and large group of insects. Some would say the most successful insect order going, really, primarily because of its flying ability. It makes this order of insects very mobile, able to colonize very large areas. And there's a lot of diversity, as you would imagine. There's over 160,000 species across the world, probably a huge underestimation, probably closer to 1 million if we were actually spent the time and really looked at all the different types of flies. I mean, when you think about it, there's over 7,000 just in the UK, 7,000 on our small little island, a relatively cold island. And when you think about some of these warmer countries, the number of flying insects, the number of true flies is absolutely enormous. And that presents us with our first challenge, doesn't it? With 7,000 species of flies, who knows them all? Nobody knows them all. Absolutely. There's no chance you're going to know all species of fly. And it's one of the challenges I always have when people send me pictures through to identify. They say, what's this type of fly? And yes, there are some common ones that we come across that are relatively easy to identify, but often pictures are blurry and they don't show the characteristics that we need to be able to do that identification. So I suppose one of the first take-home messages from today's session is don't be afraid as a pest controller to say, I don't know. I don't know what type of fly this is, but be really confident and really assure your customer that you know how to find out. And that's really important, isn't it? There's lots and lots of good resources. I'll share some of those with you today of where you can get these identifications. Many of the manufacturers will offer an identification service free of charge. Involves sending the insect off and you get a report back. And I think that's something that helps us to demonstrate our professionalism. Being confident that you don't know, but being confident to know where you can find that information out. So what makes a member of the order Diptera? Well, it's these funny knobbly bits, isn't it? These halteres. So most insects have 2 pairs of wings. They have 4 wings. And in the flies, what they've done is they've lost this hind pair of wings and they've replaced it with these little knobbly bits, these halteres. And what that means is the flies become very good at, seems quite obvious, of flying. And it means they've got great maneuverability. And anyone that's seen a green bottle, a blue bottle moving around, you can respect their ability to carry out that function of flying. They cover a huge range of habitats. They're a really diverse group of insects. We find them. Some of them are aquatic, like this chironomid fly here. Others are more terrestrial, such as this green bottle down here, and we find them in all different habitat types. So, a brief understanding of how we identify flies is quite important, and there's lots and lots of different ways of classifying things, and this nomenclature is always changing. This is the art of identifying something and organising something, giving it a label, giving it a name. And scientists are always finding new things out about insects, and they're changing what we previously thought we knew. So you've got to be a bit careful when you look at the organisation of some of these flies. But in essence, we split them into three groups, three sub-orders. So the Nematocera flies, such as this skyarrid fly at the top here, these are a group of flies, and I like to think of it as they've invested all of their energies in creating good larvae. So their larvae, when you look at them, they'll have head capsules, they might have adaptations to make the larval stage survive. And they've often got these long antennae. We have a group in the middle, the Brachycera, and these are there's always a middle ground, isn't there? And you can see this here with this tabernid fly, this horsefly here. They have a slightly different antenna, but the main difference between the Brachycera and the Cyclohapla, which are the majority of the flies, or the kind of fly that you would expect a non-pest controller to draw. If you ask someone to draw a fly, they would draw something that probably looks a bit like this fly down the bottom here. And it's all to do with how these things emerge from their pupal casing. And in these higher flies, these Cyclohapla, they emerge from their pupal casing using something called the tenellium, which is almost like a balloon that comes out of the head capsule that pops the lid off of the pupal case and enables the adult fly now to emerge from the pupa and go about its adult life. So we've got the three groups there. And when you start going a bit deeper here, you start to see the three groups of fly here, the Nematocera, the Brachycera, and the Cyclohapla. And then, wow, look at that. We've got sort of 80 odd different families of flies. So these are all the different families of flies that we have down here. And we can tell they're families because we can look at the ending, can't we? We see the IDAE, and that tells us that's a family. So that's a group of flies. And if we were just to take one of those groupings, let's take the chironomid flies here, a picture we saw just a moment ago. We're probably looking at around 300 species in that particular family. So again, there's no shame, there's no unprofessionalism about saying, hang on a minute, I don't know what type of fly this is. So we have a few, I've put a few keys there which can help you in the identification. They're a bit sort of entomologically heavy, but they are a good starting point to go to, particularly this one here. If you type into Google Diptera key to families, this will pop up and it will give you, it's free online, and it will give you a good starting point to be able to identify some of the flies to family level. And often that's as far as we need to go. Quite often, I don't spend my time, work time anyway, trying to identify Psychodidae flies to family level. You know, these are the drain flies, the filter flies. It's not necessary in most situations for our customer to know the exact species, but it's important we know that the attributes of that particular family, because that's going to have an influence on how we control those flies. Another good resource here is Mike Haxton's online keys. Again, just type in Mike Haxton keys, and you'll get keys to various different British insects. They're a fantastic resource. Really, really good resource, not just for the true flies, but for other groups of insects as well. And I'd encourage you just to have a look at those and just be amazed at the diversity of insects that we have, you know, here in the UK here, and really get to know not just the pest ones, but also some of the other interesting flies, other interesting insects that you may come about. So let's have just a recap of why we need to control cluster flies. And the classic one is this, isn't it? It's a reputation protection thing, isn't it? So I just went onto TripAdvisor here. I typed the word cluster fly or flies, And I got a couple of articles here that were sort of saying, look, hey, I stayed in this place. It was full of flies. That's disgusting. I'm not going back. And that's there for forever, isn't it? It's there for everyone to see. And the owners of these hotels, whilst they've put a reply there to say what was going on, that rating is still there. So to the general public, there's no difference between a cluster fly, a house fly, a blowfly. They're all these sort of large, hairy, disease-ridden creatures that we don't want anywhere near us when we're spending our money in a hotel or eating a meal out. So we kind of get that. But are there any other reasons? I did some research and I found an article in the New Scientist. It's quite an old article, but it talks about a train crash in, I think it was Kent, where a train went through a red light and there was an investigation. And in that investigation, they looked at the reasons as why did that train go through the red light? And they found that the output of the light was being restricted because cluster flies had occupied the light housing and potentially had caused that train not to recognize that signal that should have caused the train to stop. I then looked a bit further and I found this article here, I think it was from Germany, where they captured 50 cluster flies that had found their way into a hospital in Germany. And they found that a vast majority of them, I think it was 41 out of 50, were carrying bacillus bacteria. And some of them were even carrying much more dangerous bacteria, staphylococcus and those kind of things. And all of the flies they tested, every single one had some form of pathogen associated with the fly. After all, flies are amazing creatures for transporting bacteria. They're hairy, they're mobile. They have the way that most of them feed, certainly these hive flies, have got this proboscis that's a moist. Their mouth has got a lot of moisture, which is great conditions for bacterial development. So it's no surprise really that our cluster flies have got these bacteria on them. Nowhere near as many as a house fly or a blowfly, but there is still some form of a risk there, albeit lower, and a reason that cluster flies need to be controlled in those areas. And of course, our good friend here, the varied carpet beetle, Anthrenus verbasci. If you have ever done any work in museums or anywhere where they store insect samples, I certainly know some of my insect samples have been devoured by the larvae of this particular beetle. It's definitely something that we don't want when we're trying to look after insects. Maybe in someone's house, the presence of cluster flies encourages these carpet beetles to develop in their loft. The next thing they know, we've now got an infestation not only of cluster flies, we've now got a secondary infestation of these carpet beetles, which may cause damage to carpets, to furs, to fabrics, and those kind of things. So here is our cluster fly, and I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of people working in pest control sort of know the basic life cycle of the cluster fly and its associations. And Pollina rudis is the scientific name of the cluster fly that we most come into contact with, or we think we come into contact with. There's actually 8 species of Pollina, of the genus Pollina in the UK, and differentiating them is somewhat of a challenge. But this particular one, the Pollina rudis here, we know that it's got these golden hairs on the scutum, this bit here that covers the top of the thorax. We know it's got this checkered or tessellated abdomen, and it often holds its wings, as you can see in the picture here, sort of down the length of the body. It's quite a characteristic looking fly, and it's one of those ones that we find quite easy to identify in the field. Just be careful that these hairs on the scutum here do rub off occasionally. So sometimes, particularly with older specimens, it can look not so luscious and golden haired on there. And if you want to get really technical and really look at it, you could look for the hyperpleural bristles that are on the thoracic section, just above the spiracle that's at the back of the fly there. We know about their overwintering. This is where they come into buildings when the temperature starts to fall. The adult flies look for somewhere to hibernate, to overwinter, to see out the winter. And the strategy of these flies is to come together. There's different opinions, I suppose, of what draws them to buildings. Some people believe it's a pheromone, that is laid by the flies that aggregate them together. That's quite a common thing in insects. Other people suggest it's more of a visual clue. So where you've got areas of cluster fly breeding, the flies emerge, and then there's a visual clue to take them towards a tall building, a large tree, those kind of things. And we know about their association with earthworms. The adult fly will lay eggs on the soil, the larvae hatch out, and they move through the spaces within the soil to find earthworms. And once they find an earthworm, they go on to the top of the earthworm and they find the spiracles, the breathing holes within the earthworm, and that they enter the earthworm and live inside the earthworm, just with a little part of them hanging out. So the end of the larvae hangs out of the earthworm, and that's where its spiracle is, its breathing tube, and it takes in air that way. And the worm can have up to 7 of these larvae inside of it. And after a couple of molts, after a couple of changes from the larvae, it moves out of the worm, undergoes its pupation within the soil, the adult fly emerges, and the cycle begins again. So that's where our story changes, doesn't it, from normal fly control. Normal fly control, we think about all stages of the life cycle. If we just think about one stage of the life cycle, when we're talking about fly control, we will fail because we need to control the eggs, the larvae, the pupae, I suppose, and also the adult flies. And our larval control is in cluster flies is removed from us. We cannot go out into the fields, into grassed areas, dig up the soil, get rid of all the earthworms, and hence get rid of all the larvae. That would be an ecological disaster and very unmanageable. So our focus when it comes to cluster flies is on the adult control. And that's why I've chosen cluster flies, particularly as this time of year, they're going to be emerging from their hibernation sites, to focus on, in contrast to our small flies. Our small flies, we're going to be really looking at the hygiene controls and the non-chemical control of adults, whereas with the cluster fly, it's going to be really focused on that adult control. There are others. There are other overwintering flies. Some of which will overwinter in small numbers. And just this year, I had some building work done on my house. The back of my house was open during the winter. And lo and behold, once the building work had finished, a couple of weeks ago, there were 15 blowflies buzzing around in my kitchen area. And my wife was completely disgusted and wondered how they got in. And I explained that these flies had entered the property when it was all open to see the winter out, and now they couldn't get back out and were trapped inside. So we will get other flies overwintering. The flies don't just disappear at the onset of winter. Some of them overwinter as adults. There are some that overwinter in larger numbers, and the green cluster fly, Daisy-Phora cyanella, is one that I come across in reasonable numbers. And it almost looks like a green bottle when you look at them, and they can build up in quite large numbers. The face fly tends to be more of an agricultural nuisance fly around cattle and horses. These are the flies you often see around the face of these livestock animals. And again, they will come into buildings to overwinter, to see out the adverse conditions that are outside. And there are more. There are, of course, more. And they're not sort of homogenous. You won't find just a collection of blue bottles or just a collection of green cluster flies. Often, if you were to look at the population of flies within a building, you would find lots and lots of different species of fly all occupying the same space. And it leads us on to this character here. This is our yellow swarming fly, Thymometimia notata. And these again are a clustering fly. These are very small flies, probably the same sort of size as a fruit fly. And they belong to a family of flies called the grass flies. And these flies' larvae, instead of parasitising earthworms, they go for root aphids. So these are aphids that are attacking the roots of plants. And the larvae of these will feed on those and carry out a similar kind of life cycle to the Polyneurudis, the cluster fly. Really easy to identify. You've got these nice thick black stripes on the scutum here. And they do accumulate in large numbers. There's one study here. This was in Russia a few years ago, where 17 million of these flies were collected from a building. I'm not quite sure who counted those, but that certainly seems a huge amount. And these are all around us. This one here was one that I collected from a tree not so long ago. So they will be in our buildings, they will be in our trees, and if they do come into our building in high numbers, they can cause the similar kind of problems as pollen erudis, as the cluster fly. So that's great. We know a little bit about these flies, but the game that we're into is controlling these things. And it always boils down to integrated pest management. If you have a good understanding of integrated pest management and you follow the process through, it doesn't matter what species it is, you will always come to a good solution. And the first point of that is making sure we know what fly that we're dealing with. If we've got cluster flies, that's great. We know that we can switch off our larval control strategies. But what if it isn't a cluster fly? What if you misidentified it as, I don't know, maybe a lesser housefly, a housefly, or something like that? Then your strategy at this point would be all incorrect, because certainly with a housefly, you would need to implement some form of larval control to get to the level of control that you would like within that building. So key part of it is identification. And as Matt mentioned in that first presentation, the survey is so very important, isn't it? No two jobs are the same. It might be cluster flies in a house, but it's going to be different every time you go to a different property. There's going to be different challenges. There's going to be different things that you need to provide for that customer. And doing a really good survey at the start will help you to move through the journey of delivering professional pest control. Proofing, there's our first thing. We often think, let's keep the pests out. Can we do that with cluster flies? It's not really something that we can implement, across the board. We always think of a mouse getting through the size of a pen. When we look at flies, what size gap can they get through? And they've got a pair of wings to add to it. So proofing, across the board isn't necessarily the right solution. However, is there some form of proofing that we can do? Can we keep these flies out of high-risk areas? Can we keep them out of guest bedrooms by blocking the holes that link the attic to the bedroom to reduce the complaints? Can we put up fly screens in the hospital to prevent them getting into the real high care areas? Then yes, there is some form of proofing for management that we can do. Hygiene, when we're talking cluster flies, the larvae are living in the worms, there really is very little hygiene, and I suppose housekeeping that can be done to tackle these particular flies. And as we said before, larval control pretty much is off the menu when we're talking about cluster fly control. So we've got a few options available. Can we physically remove them? Vacuum cleaning, hoovering up flies is something that I've done, and it certainly will remove some of the flies. Can we use fly strips? Not something we enjoy using as professional pest controllers, but they have a place. They have a place. We have these kind of aesthetically good-looking cluster buster traps, which you can fit onto the window, which enable the capture of some of these flies. So there is some form of physically taking, some trapping that can be implemented. And when we're talking of the survey stage, of course, we're thinking about the environment that we're working in. And cluster flies in lofts, one of the first things that comes up into people's minds is, yes, we've got water tanks, yes, we've got the client to be careful of, but we've also got bats, haven't we? And in the UK, all species of bats are protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and they fall under Schedule 5, which means not only are they protected, the physical animal itself, but their habitat is protected as well. So we can't simply go in and do things to bats' habitats, to their roost, to their access to the roost, because that would be contravening the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Fortunately, we have the Bat Conservation Trust. Now, these guys, I think, over the years have been engaged with pest control a huge amount. I see them at trade exhibitions. I see they do articles in our magazine, and that's a really, really positive association that the BPCA and the Bat Conservation Trust have got. And these guys will offer advice. So if we've got bats in a domestic situation, we can give them a call and they will offer us advice. They have some literature they can send to you. And if it's a domestic property, they may well send someone out, a volunteer out, to assess that bat roost before any treatment is done. Commercially, I think it works a little bit different. I think you would need to pay to have that bat survey done. But for me, as a previous owner of a pest control business, when we found bats in roofs, we simply phoned the Bat Conservation Trust and we said, this is what we've got, what can we do? And we worked with them. And I found personally, they gave me great advice in every situation. Can we use fly killers? Well, We have different models of fly killers. We have some zapper style fly killers, and we have some sticky board style fly killers, don't we? We have these two main types. Now, assuming there are no bats, because obviously bats and fly killing units would not necessarily be the greatest mix, in my opinion. But we have to be careful, don't we? If we're putting EFK units within areas that cluster flies are active, and it's certainly not something we shouldn't do, but we should ensure we carry out a real good risk assessment. And you can see this fly killer here, this zapper unit here, it's got an extended catch tray here, because the number of these flies is going to be enormous, isn't it? And what would happen if they built up in the tray? Well, you could get something like this occurring. This is a story of Cranthorne Hall, a big sort of listed building, I think it is, where there were some fly killers in the roof. The flies were hitting the fly killer and building up in the tray, and it caused a spark to occur. That ignited some combustible material, and we had a big fire. So whilst we have these tools, we should be assessing the risks. We should be looking at, can I safely put this? Have I done everything that's reasonably practical to stop a major event, a bad thing from happening? And certainly, if we were going to put a sticky board unit up for cluster flies, we would need some very robust checking of that to make sure there was still space to catch the flies. But in some situations, I've seen these things work quite well. I've even seen units like this where the catch tray has been taken off and a dustbin's been put underneath, and the flies have just been collected in that way. But as I said, this is where the survey comes in. This is where we start to identify what is the right solution for this individual customer. And then we move on to our insecticides, don't we? So we have different ways of delivering the insecticide, our pyrethroid, into these environments where the cluster flies may be active. We have different types of smokes, some which are spark ignition, some which are activated by water. And these will disperse the insecticide into all the little nooks and crannies where the flies are active. And we want to make sure that we select these based on the area that we're treating. So normally a normal smoke generator will treat about 100 meters cubed. If it's anything larger than that, then we need to start measuring up the areas and working out the insecticide that's needed. Of course, we have aerosols as well. Some pest controllers don't like using these as they think they look a bit domestic, but there's certainly bits of kit that you can use as well. There's an aerosol extender which enables you to, using a lance, get the aerosol into all the nooks and crannies where the cluster flies may be entering or hibernating. And we have total release, don't we? We have these total release insecticides where you can simply take the lid off, push down, and it will emit the full can of insecticide to carry out a space treatment of an area. And of course, then we have our ULV equipment here, and there's lots and lots of different ways of delivering the insecticide to those particular areas. We have some advanced systems here which can be set with a timer. We have handheld systems that we can use. The key thing here, as always, with any form of insecticide is read the label. Make sure you're following the right instructions on the label, and also to understand the size of the area that you're treating as well. So a bit of measuring up of meter cubage to make sure the output of insecticide is right for the right area. Having done our survey, making sure that we haven't got uncovered water tanks, making sure that it's not going to leak through into a neighbouring property, make sure that it's not going to damage any wildlife or any non-target species. So I want to jump across now to some other small flies, because their treatment is very much different. So these are a group of flies, a number of flies I've put up here, that involve us predominantly looking at controlling the larval stage. Remember, the adult is just one of 4 stages in these insects' metamorphic life cycle. And the adults can be very short-lived in some situations. So just focusing your target, your treatment on the adult stage, you're really not going to get that long-term control that we really want to try and achieve. So you're probably sitting there going, I know all of these flies, but just to remind you, in case you didn't, this is one of the non-biting midges, a chironomid fly. Look at the long legs going at the front. The males have these very feathery antennae, and the wings don't really meet to the length of the body here. Here we have a filter fly, an owl midge, a sewer fly. It's one of the Cycodidae flies. And we can tell this is very hairy, and some people call it the moth fly. This is a dark-winged fungus gnat. And on this one, it's the wing venation that's very characteristic. We've got this sort of fork that appears in the wing venation there. Our good friend, the fruit fly down here with its nice red eye. This is one of the forage flies, the scuttle flies, and it's this humped thoracic section that kind of gives that away. Plus its kind of habit of running rather than flying. And of course, you can see by the long piercing proboscis here that this is one of the mosquitoes. But we said about identification and learning how to identify these flies. And sometimes in flies, not always the case, but sometimes looking at the wings is really, really important. So these are the 6 same flies that we just saw in the last slide. And if you focus some time on learning a little bit about wing venation, you'll be able to identify the flies just on their wings. So here we already spoke about that fork shape in the fungus gnat, the sciarid flies. Here we have an owl midge. We can see that it's got these straight wing veins that go all the way to the wing margin, and there's a bit of hair on the actual wing vein. This is another one that's got hair on the wing vein. This is a mosquito. So we can start to tell what family of flies we're looking at just by looking at the wings. Here we have the phorid fly, very simple wing venation with 3 veins going all the way to the wing margin. Here's our fruit fly, and at the top, the edge of the wing vein, the costal vein, we can see a couple of little nicks in it. I can't quite put my pointer on them because some of the zoom features are behind it, but I think there's one there and there's another one up there somewhere. We can see these little nicks in there. That tells us it's a member of the fruit fly family. And this rather scary looking picture here is our chironomid fly. And these different veins here have all got different names. They've got different names. And if you take a bit of time to learn some of these and start looking at fly wings, you'll be able to identify some fly families very easily just by looking at the wing veins. And to your customer, you'll see an incredibly professional and important. So I'd like to sort of finish up just with a couple of case studies with small fly control, just to put all of that into a little bit of context. So this was a supermarket, and they had a lot of filter flies, so these Cycodidae flies. And how do we find those flies? Well, firstly, the customer was saying, I've got a lot of flies. That's always a good start. But when we looked at the fly killing boards, the sticky boards on the fly killer, we could see they were full of these filter flies. So knowing the biology of these flies, we started to think about the drains. So we looked in the drains, we looked at where the water moved from. And after a short while, we came across this area here. This is actually one of 2 areas. They had one of those big industrial dishwashing lines. And what we found in these fat traps that sit below it here, we opened them up, obviously making sure that it was safe and okay to do so. Be very careful about opening machinery up that you haven't been authorized to do. But with the maintenance, we opened these up and bingo, we found our breeding site. We found the larvae, we found the adults, we found the pupa, we found the eggs. We didn't see the eggs, but we knew they must be there. We found the food source. We found everything that fly needed to complete its life cycle. So what we then investigated, we liaised with the manager and we said, okay, well, why is this allowed to happen? And what had happened is there'd been some administrative error where the company that services these things had not been out. They'd not carried out the servicing. So quite simply, servicing was undertaken of this is now showing the tray wash line. Servicing was undertaken. It was back onto a regular planned maintenance schedule, and the fly numbers, it was solved, it was sorted, it was rectified. Had we not found that breeding site, we could have introduced insecticide. What would it have done? It would have knocked the numbers down. What would have happened? They would have come back, and we would have been in this cycle that we get to. And this is what we talk about when we talk about root cause analysis. I'm sure it's a phrase you're all very, very familiar with. Here's a less successful story, and I suppose I put this one on because we're all very good at celebrating our successes and saying, yeah, that's fantastic, that worked. But I think we learn more from when we don't get it right than we do from when we do get it right. And this was a food manufacturing facility that, again, the fly killers were telling us there was lots and lots of phorid flies, these scuttle flies from the Phoridae family. And again, it led us to drains. And we looked in the drains. We must have looked in thousands of drains at this site. Where were they? We couldn't find them in the drains. Occasionally we'd find something. I mean, we found some larvae here. These aren't phorid larvae. These are another fly larvae, one of the cyclohapla larvae. But we couldn't find the answer. We didn't find that eureka moment like we did in the last case study. And it was only recently that this factory actually removed this line. So it was in this area of the factory, they removed this line, they took this line out, and you can see here, this is what we were kind of left with once the line was gone. And some contractors were doing some work on the drains, and they reported lots of flies. And when we looked in the drains, we suddenly realised that the drainage system that sat underneath this floor here was absolutely shot to pieces. There was leakage, there was spillage, there was a void underneath this floor where for the past, I don't know how many years, organic debris had leached out into there, and the fly breeding in this area was just phenomenal. There was no way in the world that we would have ever found that had that line not been removed. So sometimes it's about management with these small flies. It's not always possible or practicable to get that absolute solution, but we should never give up trying. We should certainly always make sure that we're doing the right things. One last case study, and then I will pass over because I don't want to keep Ian waiting. This came from yesterday. So I was at a factory yesterday, and this factory had always had a challenge with fruit flies. Here we see this is a picture of the kind of numbers of fruit flies that we were seeing regularly in this factory. I've been going there for about 7 years. And every time it was, you need to sort your hygiene out, you need to clean this machine, you need to get a proper cleaning schedule in place. And they hadn't done it. And I turned up yesterday and I walk into the factory and I go to the usual places where I find my fruit flies, and guess what? No fruit flies. And I look at the machinery and I think, actually, that's really clean. And I start to investigate further. And I start to understand that something has happened in that business. I don't know what it was, but there's a new hygiene guy on site. And he proudly shows me his cleaning schedule of how he gets this machine out, how he's segregated, how he's formulated his cleaning plan. And a lot of that was driven off the report that I gave them. So in the reports that I provided, I continually mentioned what was needed to be done, continually recommending the cleaning that is needed to control the flies. No one was listening for years, but eventually something happened. And for the first time forever, really, at this factory, I found no fruit flies in any of the areas where I'd normally find lots of fruit flies. It works. It does work. They still have drain flies. There was still a few drain flies lurking around. And that's the next challenge. That's now challenging that organisation on to look at their drainage and what could be done to get rid of that individual fly species within that individual area. So again, a nice story about the importance of identifying the right fly will drive you to the right solution and the right area to be looking at. Survey, hygiene. Hygiene is by far the most important way of controlling flies, small flies particularly, because it removes all of these things. Of course, we need some form of adult control, and there are options for doing that. But I quite like this traffic light approach to survey, carry out the hygiene, manage the environment, and then mop up the control of the adults. I will park it there, I think, because I'm getting the virtual crook
popping up and surprising you.
Me off there.
No, listen, I wanted to get some questions in. I mean, we're sort of 10 minutes over, but we've got some great questions. So I wanted to get at least one really good one in. So I was trying to decide myself, which is bad, which one's the best one. But I think what might benefit everybody here is there's a question about EFKs or GFKs in terms of their effectiveness against different species. So cluster flies, fruit flies. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, the fly killers are very useful. Certainly, I've always had good success with cluster flies on EFK traps. I've had success with fruit flies on EFK traps. It becomes a bit more difficult because the EFK needs to be in an area that's going to capture the flies. And essentially, the flies are often breeding in the drains on the floors. So we stick a fly killer, 8 foot away on the wall somewhere and expect these flies that are breeding on the floor to make this huge journey up to the fly killer. So it's important to get the fly killer to where it needs to be as safely as possible. There's always been this thing, isn't there, about the lesser housefly and the housefly's attractiveness to EFK units. And I, a few years ago, spoke to an American entomologist who's, sort of quite an important character over in the US. And I asked him that question, and his response to me was, I've never had a problem with houseflies and lesser houseflies on these units. I think fly killers are important, definitely, but it's about thinking where the flies are breeding. And as I've always thought, we do the work, not the pests. So what we want to do is get the control measure as close to where the pests are active, and not expect them to go on this huge journey to find the fly killers.
But you're absolutely right. That is a common thing out in the industry, that we're being told certain flies don't have the correct vision to be able to detect the UV and all these things. And actually, because I've had that myself, talking to people about it, and I'm thinking, well, I've caught these flies before, but am I just imagining it? And you just kind of play games with yourself, don't you?
There are lots of things, aren't there, that we get taught as pest controllers that just become, if I said name a cluster fly, everyone would say Pollina rudis. That would be the cluster fly. Yet there are, in the UK, there are eight Pollina flies out there, one of which you can really only distinguish from Pollina rudis by doing a dissection of the genitalia. So, but as an industry, we're like, oh yeah, we definitely got Pollina rudis, because that's what we're taught. I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just that's what we kind of get, these things that go through industries, don't you? So
absolutely.
The principles of IPM are the key things to it, aren't they? They're about understanding where they're breeding and to factor in the whole life cycle.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, listen, there's a couple of questions on there, like I've done before. If you don't mind sort of hanging around for the next 10, 20 minutes and going on to the chat, and maybe people can put their questions on there. I think you can see the Q&As, can't you?
Yeah, I can see the Q&A. So
you can do
I'll have a look at those
typing.
questions, and if I can provide anything that's of worth, I'll
type
drop
it in there.
And,
great.
And see, but we don't want to keep the boss man waiting.
No, indeed. All right. Thank you, Paul. Take care.
All right,
now.
Lovely. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Great.